All right, so now we're still on day one of cannabinoids and now to part two. So in this part, I'll talk a little more about the history of marijuana use in society and its development. So here we go. All right, so last time I talked about the pros and cons. So yeah, I might as well check those over again. I won't go through them again, but let's now dive into the history and the evolving views of marijuana use, and also why it ultimately did become an illicit drug or Schedule One drug. All right, so this somewhat can be summarized in this one movie that came out in the 30s or so. It shows how aggressively certain segments of the population, both in the news and in politics and in the media, really pushed to drive marijuana use into the illegal status and to demonize it. So if you have not seen Reefer Madness, I highly recommend. Please please go to the video, watch the original Reefer Madness. It is an eye opener, and there are some absolutely wonderful quotes from Reefer Madness. The burning weed with its roots in hell. I mean, good writing there. So it's a fantastic movie to watch, and pretty much everything in that movie related to marijuana use is wrong. It's just to say, but it's a wonderful little exploration into the past views of marijuana use and hints as to why society has had such a negative opinion of marijuana use for so long. So yes, almost everything in Reefer Madness is wrong. But it really set the stage and told you where society was thinking about marijuana use. And now those views have pretty much held for over 70 years and only recently have been changing since maybe 2010, where the majority now may be or is in favor of legalizing marijuana use. But the first step towards making it illegal, and it was a big step because it would effectively making it illegal, was the Marijuana Tax Act in 1937. And so that's where the illegality really started. It was overturned in 1969. But the funny thing is, yes, it was overturned in 1969, but in 1970, marijuana became a Schedule One narcotic, which means no medical or research use whatsoever, which I think many researchers would disagree with, but that's the reality, and that's what it became, Schedule One narcotic in 1970. So essentially, it's been consistently illegal since 1937. So why has there been all this negativity about marijuana for so long, and why has it been illegal for so long? And a lot actually can be traced to one man. This guy, Harry Anslinger. So he, he got support because he really tapped into a lot of feelings of society falling apart and maybe some racism as well. But he was the commissioner of narcotics from 1930 to 1962. That's a long time to be the head honcho, essentially, of the narcotics area. And so that means his opinions really could entrench themselves into U.S. policy on drug use. And I've got to read this quote because it just kind of puts into perspective his mindset through those years. By the tons it is coming into this country, the deadly, dreadful poison that racks and tears not only the body, but the very heart and soul of every human being who once becomes a slave to it, and any of its cruel and devastating forms. Marijuana, so I guess the H was in there early on, is a shortcut to the insane asylum. Smoke marijuana, cigarettes for a month, and what was once your brain will be nothing but a storehouse of horrid specters. Hashish makes a murderer who kills for the love of killing, out of the mildest mannered man who ever laughed at the idea that any habit could ever get him. Yes, so he was pretty dramatic. I wouldn't be surprised if he wrote some of the great lines in Reefer Madness. So yes, Anslinger really set the stage and set the entire tone, and was very good too with interacting with the media, getting very targeted media posts in the newspapers that promoted his policy. Um, yes, and so he really also is the force behind that Marijuana Tax Act and the first major uh, decriminalization of marijuana use. All right. All right. So of course, marijuana use goes way back before Anslinger, way, way, way back. And so it's a plant that is effectively a weed. It grows very easily in many climates, and people have used it for recreational, medicinal purposes for many thousands of years. Probably originated in China over 6,000 years ago. For both medical and religious use. It spread also to India and the Arab world then. It got to more of the Western world with Napoleon's invasions. His soldiers brought it to France from Egypt, and then became quite popular with the French writers and artists at the time. It was grown, it was one of the very first crops grown here in America, brought over here, but mostly for practical things like rope, paper, and clothes. George Washington, he grew hemp at his farm. Probably smoking, at least the idea of smoking it and maybe using strains that were better for smoking, came to the U.S. with immigration from Mexico and the Caribbean. And that association with immigrants and minorities, specifically Mexicans and blacks, probably contributed to this kind of political, xenophobic, racism kind of fear in the U.S. And Anslinger, Nixon, Richard Nixon, our friend we've talked about before, really capitalized on that to get their policies enacted. All right. All right. So what are some of the negative effects? Well, it is worth pointing out these now. So let's go back to some of the good, the bad, and the ugly. We have talked a little bit about some of the potential medical uses with epilepsy, anxiety, pain with marijuana, but what are some of the negative effects of use, and especially high use? Well, one, although I definitely will list this maybe as a positive effect, but way back with the ancient Greek physician Galen, one of the most famous Greek physicians, maybe only right behind Hippocrates, Hippocrates, if you watch Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. But yes, Galen, one of the most famous physicians, cautioned that marijuana use might lead to senseless talk. And I bet he was right. Smart guy. All right, but more than that, I mentioned this earlier in the pros and cons, but if you do have a genetic predisposition to schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, then you are at increased risk for going into a more or less permanent state of psychosis, or at least lasting psychosis, if you use marijuana. There is correlational evidence for that. That's not just from one lab or study, but from multiple studies. So if you have that particular genetic predisposition, I would maybe be a little more cautious about your use. Overdose or just taking very high doses definitely can lead to some temporary psychotic episodes, hallucinations, paranoia. It's easier to overdose now because the concentrations of the psychoactive component, THC, is higher nowadays. So, but overall, I don't want to have everybody freak out here. There's really, it's amazing, honestly, that you can take very, very high doses of the drug, yet there are no reports of any death from overdose. It's very, very unpleasant, but no reports of death. So relative to other drugs, alcohol, especially opioids and things like that, overdose or even sustained use is not associated with, for example, cancer, or your breathing doesn't stop in the case of opioids. So yeah, overdose, very, very, very unpleasant, but it won't, at least so far, not killed anybody. All right, so like I mentioned too in the negatives again, it can impair driving performance significantly, especially when mixed, for example, with alcohol. There may be, and this is, I suggested that teen use is still being investigated, so taking it early on in life when your brain is doing a lot of development might not be the best idea. And so the evidence is still sparse on this, but there's some evidence, one or two papers suggesting it may reduce IQ if you take it early on in life. And also with the increase perhaps in the portion of available marijuana, the portion of THC increases in marijuana, it appears to correlate with in the amount of dependence. People who become dependent or abuse marijuana seems to be increasing. It's still a lower risk of dependence relative to the more commonly available legal drugs like alcohol and cigarettes, but it's a potential concern and could get worse if the amounts, for example, of the psychoactive components and availability keeps rising. All right, so talking about dependence, actually there is an official disorder in the DSM-5, which is, again, the kind of the gold standard recipe book that psychiatrists, psychologists, doctors use to diagnose different mental disorders, different type of psychological disorders. And so there is an official disorder, cannabis use disorder, CUD. And so, yeah, they have like we talked about before, there's like a whole checklist of items. If you have so many on that checklist, you may fall into the category of CUD. All right, but saying that, again, let's put things in perspective. Dependence following first-time use of the drug of cannabis is definitely lower than the other drugs we've talked about. 9% relative to alcohol, 15%, cocaine at 17%, heroin at 23%, and nicotine, wow, 32%. And so cannabis definitely lower than those, but 9% for first-time use, given that many people are using cannabis, it's still a large amount. Yeah, so people who use it regularly, that transition from using it regularly to actually being a situation of use disorder where you really can't stop, even though it's kind of messing with your life. With all the dependence by regular users, let's say you're taking it, for example, for chronic pain or anxiety, that portion goes up. So if you take it regularly, you're more likely to become an abuser. Maybe not surprising, but it seems pretty high for cannabis. All right, so things to remember from all those numbers. Dependence is relative to other drugs of abuse low, but 9% is still a fairly big number when you have a lot of people using something. All right, regular use, let's say for pain or anxiety, can definitely increase the risk for dependence. And what is dependence? In general, it means when you have withdrawal symptoms, when you stop using, and you also subjectively rate the effect of the drug on your life as being overall negative. So a part of you really wants to stop, but you can't really, or you're having a hard time doing it. Okay, overdosing. Being careful with edibles is another thing just to be aware of. It's particularly easy to overdose with edibles, given that it takes a while for the drug to kick in and get into your brain and become active. That slow onset time may make you tempted to eat some more and then eat some more so that you get the effect. But if you keep doing that, you just might be causing the concentrations in an hour or so to really become way, way higher than you ever wanted. And so it's easy to overdose with let's say a pot brownie. And also it's easier to overdose given that there's higher concentrations generally of THC out there in the market. So other things that contribute to overdose is that unlike some of these other drugs we've talked about, there's a very long half-life for THC. It's like 25 to 57 hours. It's crazy. And so it takes that's the amount of time it takes for half of the drug to be broken down. So that's a long time. It's partly because some of it hides out in your lipids and then slowly gets released. But yeah, it just takes a long time for it to be broken down. And so you keep building it up. And since it's not into the brain for a little while by edibles, yeah, you get a big hit later on in the day, more than you perhaps bargained for. All right. And you already mentioned that concentrations of THC have been steadily increasing, probably due to market demand, but not necessarily health demand. So yeah, this is the crazy statistic, is that the percent of THC in cannabis that you would, let's say, buy from a dispensary or get on the street was 3% in the 1980s and rose to about 12% in 2014. So that's a 4-time increase. That's a huge increase in that. Okay, so going back to overdose, I put this here. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but please read it. It's just a little story from one of the columnists, Maureen Dowd. She's a pretty well-known columnist in the New York Times, but it just describes her experience with edible marijuana, where she did not, and it actually wasn't labeled what the proper dose was on the candy bar, and so she consumed way too much. But anyway, it gives you a little subjective report of what it's like to truly overdose on marijuana. Not fun, not fun, but yeah, it's a good story of what happens when you eat maybe a bit too much. All right, with the coyote, I will end this segment.